position like that. So that deserves a round of applause. I love South Dakota. So thank you so much, Ian, for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. You know, Governor Roden is a tough act to follow, but I'm going to certainly do my best. You know, just a few minutes ago, who here was in here when they played that, "It's a fetus, we're having a fetus" video? And the little girl goes, "It's called a baby." We are working on a bill this upcoming legislative session. You know, our state laws, our statutes say fetus, 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 all over the place. We're working on a law to make it so that our statutes reflect the pro-life reality. South Dakota is a state that respects the right to life of every unborn child, and our laws and the language in our laws should reflect that. Again, thank you to Jen. Thank you to everyone with South Dakota Right to Life and everyone who attended this conference. And I want to say a special thank you to Dale for extending the invitation to have me speak a couple of months ago. You know, Dale has been such a leader and an example to so many of us in the movement. And, you know, the other day I was convicted to focus on the verse 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. It's a long sentence, so I'm going to repeat it again. Always be prepared to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. When I think of Dale Barcher, I think of a very hopeful man, a man who always communicates with gentleness and respect, and never with vitriol, never with anger, always with hope and God's love. And he's a tremendous example of that. But, and this is no offense to Dale, I can think of a better example of that. I can think of a young man who lost his life 17 days ago, who really, to my generation, was the best example of open and civil and godly, loving and hopeful communication. I was going to talk to you all today about communications in the 21st century and how to be pro-life and communicate pro-life in the 21st century media climate. But then the best example of how to do that lost his life for speaking the truth. And so my speech changed. You know, I'm 32 years old. I turned 32 years old 2 months ago. Charlie would have turned 32 next month. He's 3 months younger than me. He's got a beautiful, godly wife. I've got a beautiful, godly wife. Hannah's sitting in the back there with our daughter. Our daughter Vida, who, by the way, Vida is Spanish for life. We found out we were having her when we were in Costa Rica, where their national slogan is Pura Vida, which means good life. And we started jokingly calling her Vida, and it just kind of stuck. So I've got a daughter named Life, and she'll always have that story. Charlie's kids are just barely older than mine each. I think they're 3 and 1, and mine are 2 and 9 months. And truth be told, you know, for a lot of my career, I've been jealous of Charlie Kirk. He's my age. He does similar things to what I do. He's a conservative communicator, and he's better at it than me. I went to Hillsdale College. I went to the paragon of how to be a young conservative. He didn't graduate from college. Who does he think he is? And then at his funeral, I never realized that Charlie had studied under Hillsdale professors, taking Hillsdale's online courses his whole adult life. And my former professor, the president of Hillsdale, Larry Arnn, stood up at that funeral and he said, Charlie Kirk's one of the 4 or 5 most impressive young individuals I've ever met, and the others are all Hillsdale students. And he wasn't talking about me. You know, I didn't know Charlie well, but I knew him for years. Met him several times, usually in the presence of some of my bosses, whether that be Governor Noem or Congressman Jim Jordan. And he was always kind. But I first knew of him when I was much younger, when he was much younger, when he was just getting started, when he was maybe a little more bombastic in his communications and a little more edgy and trying to get a viral video. And so that was the version of Charlie that I thought I knew. And I didn't realize, for all the growth and maturity that I've done since I was 18, the 31-year-old husband and father, Charlie Kirk, was a very grown and different and mature, godly man, and how far he had come in that journey. So you might wonder why I'm here. Why, out of all the young men in South Dakota, why am I the one standing at this podium right now? Well, I have the honor of serving as Governor Larry Roden's unborn child advocate. I had the honor of doing that for Governor Noem previously. But far before that, my parents met because my dad was president of Texas Right to Life. And my mom was a grassroots activist. And they met, and they started the family. And 5 months after they got married, my older brother was born. And I'll let you all do the math on that. And then they had 5 more babies. There's 6 of us. So before we were even born, they were already setting that example to us of practicing what you preach, of being pro-life, of being pro-family. You know, and we were raised that way. My mom was a campaign manager for several local candidates. I grew up in Houston, Texas, so in and around Houston. And from a very young age, I was knocking on doors and hanging pamphlets, whether for church or for conservative candidates. But it wasn't until I was 7 that there was ever a moment where I sort of internalized what it meant to be pro-life. My youngest sister, Hallie, is 7 years younger than me. She was born 2 months early. And I remember the day she was born. I saw her for the first time, and she was so small. She weighed 3 pounds. She was not able to breathe unassisted. When I went to see her, I was thinking, why is her head shaped like that, and why is she that color? You know, newborn babies are red and splotchy, and I didn't get to hold her. And I didn't see her very much when she was still in the hospital. I think my parents knew that it was difficult for us kids to go in and out of the hospital. I went a couple times. But I remember the day she came home. Because again, she was the 6th out of 6. I was 3rd. And it was very rare that I would come home from school by myself. I don't know that it ever happened besides this day, that none of my other siblings came home with me. And my mom had just brought baby Hallie home that day. And so I, for a couple hours straight, got one-on-one time with my newborn, 2-month-old, now able to leave the hospital sister. And I remember holding her and looking down at her, sitting in that recliner that we'd gotten during my mom's pregnancy, because it was a difficult pregnancy, and realizing how precious she was. And realizing that she was the same baby then, at roughly her due date, as she was 2 months prior when she was 2 months early. And so you walk that back, you walk that back further. The question Charlie Kirk would always ask is, okay, when do they become a baby? And I probably didn't make quite that realization when I was 7, but it was the start down that path. I did go to Hillsdale College. I graduated with a degree in political economy. I thought I was going to work on tax policy my whole life. I went to work for a pro-life leader in Kansas as a policy analyst, Governor Sam Brownback in Kansas. That's where I met Peter, who I believe you all heard from earlier today, a true pro-life champion. Governor Brownback really liked the things that I wrote, and he asked me to start working in communications, and I haven't really ever looked back. I've had the honor of working for real pro-life champions over the 10 years of my career. Sam Brownback was the first governor in the nation to sign a ban on dismemberment abortion into law. He did that just before I was hired, so I was sad that I missed that. But he was a tremendous example of using your faith to advocate for the pro-life cause. Sam Brownback goes to Mass every day to this day. He is a compassionate, kind man, and he talks that way, and he shares that heart, and that's how he talks about life. I I worked for some other very different leaders with different styles over the years. I worked for Jim Jordan. I was his communications director in Congress for 2 years. Jim Jordan, if you've seen him on TV, he's kind of brash. He's a fast talker. He's an excellent communicator, but he can prosecute an argument with the best of them. But the way that he talks about life is different than he talks about really any other issue, because he is never not someone who anyone would think is afraid to pick a fight and to take a challenge on and to call it out for what it is. The man's a 2-time national champion wrestler. He's a fighter to his core. But when it comes to the issue of life, when I started working for Congressman Jordan, he told me, we never say abortion in this office. We always talk about life. And I wondered, why is that? Because that was new to me. That was different to me. And it was because he wanted to share the reason for the hope that he has. And on this issue, to communicate it with gentleness and with respect. And that surprises people about him when I tell them that, but he was truly an example to me in that. You know, I loved working for Congressman Jordan. I did not love living in D.C. Most of my family by this time was scattered across the heartland. I got brothers and sisters in mostly Nebraska and Wisconsin. So opportunity came knocking to go to work for a woman in South Dakota named Kristi Noem, who the first time I met Kristi Noem was at the Kansas Right to Life Convention, I think in 2016, when she came to speak and told her story. I met her then and never thought that I'd work for her, but I was very impressed by her. And so I moved here coincidentally in April 2020 and had the opportunity to escape the DC lockdowns and move to freedom-loving South Dakota. And we got some incredible pro-life legislation passed alongside Dale and several of the legislators in this room over the last few years. When the Dobbs decision leaked in the spring of 22, does everyone remember that? I can remember where I was. I was at the park playing disc golf when that happened. We knew we had to be ready for when that decision inevitably came out. And so Governor Noem and I got to work on a new website to message, because we knew that South Dakota's trigger law would become law. And so we got to work on a website to be a resource for mothers and babies and families. We called it life.sd.gov, so that any mom who found herself in a difficult situation where maybe in the past she might have considered abortion, which now is no longer legal in South Dakota, would have the opportunity to find whatever resources she could need, whether that be pregnancy resources, parenting resources, financial assistance if she qualified, or if she wants to give a child up for adoption, how do I even start? And the day that the Dobbs decision came out, we put that website live within a couple of hours. And I remember that weekend following Dobbs, there were a lot of conservatives across the country who were worried about how this would impact the midterm elections. And what were we going to do about that? And the Democrats were going to have all the energy. And Governor Noem went on multiple Sunday shows that weekend, both ABC and CBS's shows, and passionately and articulately argued for the hope that we have, the proactive reason why this was good for the country. For starters, as a real advocate of states' rights, the fact that states should make whatever decisions make the most sense for their own people, but also on the questions that were being thrown in our face with issues like rape and incest, the heart of not wanting to perpetuate tragedy with another tragedy. And she shared how loving and caring we can be to moms and babies through an approach like what we'd accomplished with life.sd.gov. Now, as you've seen, I work for another pro-life leader, Governor Larry Roden, who's now been in office for about 8 months. But through all those experiences, you can learn a lot from leaders like that, but you can never learn what you would learn in your own life and in your own experiences. My wife Hannah's sitting in the back of the room, and I remember back 3 years ago, about three years and 3 years and half a month ago, to the day we got engaged. And Hannah said yes, and we had a great moment. And then The rest of the day, she was just cranky. And I asked her, are you upset? What's wrong? Is everything okay? Are you regretting saying yes? She had no idea why she was cranky. And 6 hours later, we found out we were having a baby, not a fetus. And you know, it might not be ideal that I'm making that admission from the pulpit of a church. But that's our story. And in that moment, and I got Hannah's permission to say this, Hannah would tell you that in that moment, she understood why women who feel trapped and feel the need to get an abortion feel the way that they do. Not that it was a real consideration, but it made sense in a way that it never had before. Because it's not a situation that we sought out. It's not what our plan was. We were going to get married and then we were going to have babies. That's how it's supposed to go. But that was the path that was put in front of us. And now we've got a beautiful 2.5-year-old boy named Gavin who's running around in the nursery upstairs, probably wreaking all kinds of havoc. He was 4 months old on our wedding day. And I often say that our wedding was the best day of my life, but his birth was the most important day of my life. Because I remember standing in that delivery room. Gavin's born, and I stick my hand out, and he immediately grabbed my finger. And in a far more powerful way than even holding my baby sister 2 months old, or even listening to these powerful pro-life leaders, I had that connection, that understanding of why we communicate and do what we do. Everyone who's had a baby knows what that feels like. Not everyone's had a baby. So how do you communicate the power of that moment to people who have never lived it? Well, that's what I'm here to talk to you about. You know, I've had the opportunity to work in communications roles for governors, congressmen, on political campaigns. Following the Dobbs decision, up until the Dobbs decision, the unborn child advocate in Governor Noem's office had always been a lawyer. It had always been either her general counsel or her deputy general counsel. I'm a communications director. I'm not a lawyer. Do not accuse me of being a lawyer. If you need legal advice, John Hansen's in the back of the room. If you need help writing a tweet or a speech, give me a call. But the nature of the battle changed. The nature of what we were doing changed because South Dakota's laws became pro-life. But now we needed to win the hearts of the people to defend those laws. And so Governor Noem put a communicator in that position, and I hope that I'm living up to it. And that takes us to the moment that we're at today. 17 days ago, a brilliant, articulate, hopeful young man was killed for doing what he loved and for doing what so many of us strive to do, which is talking to people with gentleness and respect. And it would be impossible for us not to recognize the gravity of that moment. I know that probably everyone in this room and millions of people across the country feel the weight of it, and also the realization, most of the folks in this room probably already realized that we're in a spiritual struggle, even before September 10th. The nature of our struggle feels very spiritual at its core, but so many more Americans woke up to that fact. Tens of millions of Americans watched his funeral, including 200,000 in one building. That's incredible. It's unheard of. I was watching the Packers game. Sorry, I'm a Packers fan. I'm sure there's Vikings fans in here. Go Pack Go. I was watching the Packers game when the funeral started, and I never turn Packers games off, but I did that day. They lost. I'm glad I did. And I could not click away. And it wasn't until I got to the Capitol to attend a vigil that we were holding for Charlie Kirk, and the funeral still wasn't over, that I had to turn it off. But the very last thing I heard before I turned it off, Erica Kirk was at the podium. And the very last thing I heard was her saying, "I forgive that young man." And in that moment, she became an even more powerful example of giving the reason for the hope that we have than Charlie ever was. That's hard to do. And she did it with the utmost of gentleness and respect, and I believe that's what we're called to do today, so I want to talk about how we can do that. You know, we need to talk with optimism, we need to talk with love. Yesterday, Joel quoted scripture saying love covers over a multitude of sins. There were a lot of people who went to podiums, to microphones, standing across from Charlie Kirk, who tried to antagonize him into a battle, into an argument, into a screaming match, whatever, right? They said inflammatory things, they made fun of him. He never took the bait. He never hurled insults back at them. He communicated with optimism and love. And that's what we need to do. We need to speak with humility, with kindness, with positivity. The first thing that we did when the Dobbs decision was announced, we didn't spike the football. Neither did the Packers on Sunday. We launched a website that was focused on taking care of moms and babies before birth and after. That was the tagline. And we did that because we knew that those moms were who we were trying to reach to. We can't just talk to ourselves. We can't talk to each other. We have to reach beyond rooms like this one and impact hearts. And how do you do that? Well, Charlie was a great example of that too. Whenever someone came to a podium and challenged him on his pro-life positions, the first thing he did every time was he asked questions. He did not immediately rebut whatever they were saying. He did not antagonize. He asked them questions. He wanted to understand their position because he realized that once he started asking those questions, their position would fall apart. There's no tenable, cohesive, philosophical basis for abortion. It doesn't exist. So we'd ask them, is murder wrong? Was usually the first question. They would immediately start saying, well, abortion's not murder. I didn't ask that question. I asked you, is murder wrong? Of course it is. Everyone thinks it is. Okay, when does life begin? They'd throw out some answers. Some of them said, oh, when a heart starts beating, when they feel pain. Some would say when they're born. To that, I'd say, my sister was just as alive 2 months before I held her, when she wasn't supposed to be born yet. And inevitably, he would give the argument for why whatever arbitrary line they drew was wrong. So then what makes an unborn baby different from any other human? What makes that baby any less deserving of human rights? Was where he inevitably ended up. And while he mentioned his faith, he usually didn't lead with it. He usually gave a scientific or even a philosophical argument and then followed it up with the opportunity to witness with the gospel. So the way that he won those hearts and minds, he understood the position of the person standing in front of them, and then he gave them the ammunition to challenge that position on their own. One of the reasons I was so jealous of Charlie Kirk was, what did he do? He went onto university campuses and won the hearts and minds of college kids. And I thought, why are you doing that? There's no way that could ever work. There's no way. I went to Hillsdale College to avoid that kind of university setting because that's impossible. He did it. And that's how. He was never against the position of the person standing across from him. He was always for something. And I watched this video again last night. There's a really, really powerful example where two young ladies step up to the microphone, twins, products of IVF. Pro-life young ladies. And they step up to the microphone and they ask him, hey, can you explain your position on IVF? We're products of IVF, we want to understand it. And he started by asking questions. He asked, so you're twins, I assume? Yes. So how many babies were created when you were created? Well, 3. Our older sisters are also twins. 4 were created when they were created. And he says, so you understand that those were your siblings, right? They said yes. And he said, but then it's very hard for me as a pro-life person to stand here and say that IVF's not pro-life, because look at you, you're here and you're alive, and that's wonderful. But My faith tells me that God creates life, and I don't believe that humans should play God. And in addition to that, IVF can be done in a way that doesn't discard life if it must be done. And those women walked away from the other microphone clapping for Charlie Kirk, because he communicated with gentleness and respect. We are not against the position of those who oppose us. We are for life. That's why Jim Jordan never said abortion. We're for life. We're for all life. Conception until natural death, right? But it's unborn life that's under threat. It's unborn life that for so many years our laws have not recognized the rights of the unborn child. Now they do in South Dakota, and in a way, it's almost like we were the dog that caught the car. And for a minute, it looked like we didn't know what we were supposed to do next. Well, now we need to be for those moms' lives too. There's a friend of mine who often says, when was the last time that Planned Parenthood paid anyone's rent? They accuse us of only being pro-birth and not caring about that child once it's born, or not having any care whatsoever for that mom. That's not true. When's the last time Planned Parenthood paid anyone's rent? When's the last time a church paid someone's rent? Or did a diaper drive like is happening right down the hall? That is what it means to communicate with gentleness and with respect. We have to be wise. We also have to be smart. And now I'm going to talk a little more about what I originally was going to talk to you all about today. We have to communicate wisely, but we always have to be smart. We have to be informed and prepared for the difficult conversations that are going to come in front of us. And we need to be cognizant of the environment that we're in. And a lot of the folks in this room, with all due respect, grew up in the 20th century, and we're in the 21st, right? It's a very different media climate, technological climate. The world has changed over the years. It doesn't mean that the way that we communicate changes, but it does mean that the means that we use to do that communicating has changed. Charlie Kirk understood this implicitly. In 1 Peter 5:8, Peter writes, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour." I've always been intrigued by that verse because Christ is the lion, right? So why is Peter calling the devil a lion? Well, he isn't. He says like a lion. Like a lion. He's trying to act like he is what Christ actually is. But be alert and of sober mind. We have to be alert to the realities of the media environment that we live in, and particularly social media. People are already waking up to the spiritual nature of our fight, but they have not yet understood the depths to which many of our institutions have been co-opted by those with a much darker agenda, frankly. So I want you all to know the players, know the media, know the social media platforms. The modern media environment has completely changed from even just a few years ago. I work in it every day, and so I've watched the change happen. There was a poll done by Pew a couple of years ago where they studied how do people get their information, and then based on that, how informed are they? They asked, do you read newspapers? Do you read online newspapers? Do you watch cable news? Do you watch your local TV? Do you get your news off of social media? Overwhelmingly, older folks either read newspapers or read the news online, and some of them watched cable news. Younger folks tended to get their news off of social media. Interestingly, the folks who were actually the least informed on current events were not those who got their news off of social media. That was second. It was folks who watched their local TV station who were the least informed. And I've got friends who work for KELOLAND or Dakota News Now or KOTA, but they're not what the version of events that is preached on the local news every night is not the reality of what's going on in the world, and that study reflected that. It's part of why folks are changing the channel. People are realizing that. But the second least informed was that social media audience, and it's growing, and it's young folks like me who are primarily getting their news off of social media. I primarily get my news off of social media, and then I go and verify it somewhere, right? But most people don't do that second step. Who's got the time? I have to do it for a living. I have to have the time, but most people don't. And so when you hear something inflammatory or surprising or strange, take the time to verify it. Take the time to find something that actually supports it rather than just whatever you read on Facebook or saw on TikTok. Please. We also need to know that a lot of knowledge has been spread about how traditional newspapers are failing. I was just talking about how both the Argus and the Rapid City Journal have lost all kinds of subscribers, right? Well, that left a vacuum that is being filled by new media outlets. So who are they? There's this nonprofit outlet. It's called South Dakota Searchlight. There's another nonprofit that was already in the state called South Dakota Newswatch. But Searchlight is newer and far more, they're stronger. They've got a very strong team of folks. And they are bankrolled by left-wing interests. And they offer their news for free to all of the traditional media that you know, the Argus Leader, KELOLAND, Dakota News Now, the Rapid City Journal. They get to print what Searchlight writes for free because it's all supported by donors. Well, if you ever open a newspaper and you read a byline that says South Dakota Searchlight, I need you to know that. Because most folks don't, and most folks are surprised when I tell them that. But it's bankrolled by East Coast left-wing interests, and they have a version of South Dakota Searchlight in every state in the country. There are other newer media outlets in cities across the state. The Dakota Scout out of Sioux Falls, the Rapid City Post out of Rapid City, the Aberdeen Insider. These are, I would say, more middle of the road, not trying to take a political slant. I think the journalists by nature, by virtue of the education that they got, are left-leaning, but they're trying not to be, because I think they're realizing that their target audience is regular South Dakotans who are not left-leaning. If you actually want people to buy your newspaper, you can't just be a leftist blog. But that's a struggle. So if you ever come into contact with those reporters, encourage them to tell the truth and to tell it from the middle. I'm not asking for media to be conservative, although it's nice when they are. South Dakota has a real opportunity in front of us. We have an opportunity to celebrate some incredible wins. Last night was great. Wasn't that fun? But Leslie said something important. She said we won because we lost before. And if we want to keep winning and not lose again, we cannot be complacent. And we cannot let the wheels go rusty. We got here by showing the inconsistency of the so-called pro-woman position. That was really the closing argument of the battle against Amendment G. And it was powerful. And we won persuadable voters because of it. But we cannot settle. Our laws can still improve. We have the most pro-life laws in the country, and I'm not happy with that. Let's keep going. We've got a governor who just told us he wants to see pro-life legislation on his desk. We've got legislators in this room who want to pass pro-life laws. And together we can communicate in a way that wins the people over as we're doing that. I'd love to talk with any of you through the rest of the day about how we can do that. The specific opportunities that we have in front of us. I want to work with all of you. And Dale, Jen, I'm excited to get it done, okay? Thank you all. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was so good and powerful, and I'm glad you changed your speech just a little. It was very poignant. And now it is time to invite our pregnancy centers up to the platform. So if you are in